compensation doesn't always have to be 100%. Don't hire for somebody and then all of a sudden expect they are going to do everything. We talked about hiring them, but why did they leave? What's another question that I should be asking you that I haven't thought of asking? Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. One thing that we don't talk enough about is hiring A players. There's a big difference between bringing in an A player in your company versus a B player, C player, and so forth. I mean, an A player, you can have a 10-to-1 plus ROI on the money that you're investing in that person. A B player could drop all the way down to maybe a 2-to-1, and a C player probably just breaking even. But the difference between A players, B players, and C players also is the amount of time that you're going to invest in a person. With an A player, they're going to be the smartest person for that particular role. So there's going to be very little hand-holding. There's going to be obviously some management, very little hand-holding. With a B player, now there's going to be a lot more hand-holding and interaction from management. But a C player, now there's a lot more time that's going to be required from you. So what I did today is I wanted to bring together one of the most talented, brilliant women that I know when it comes to understanding the differences between A, B, and C players. She actually works from the side of the candidate. So we're going to see that viewpoint from the side of the candidate as opposed from the side of the employer. So without further ado, the CEO of DNS Executive Career Management, Debra Boggs. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Really excited to be here for this conversation. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, you and I had this great conversation on a board of directors meeting recently where we are going back and forth about bringing in A player salespeople and C-suites and all that other stuff. And I know you get involved everything from hiring VPs, hiring C-suites, hiring board members, and so forth. It was really interesting to hear your perspective on what these candidates are looking for before they make a decision. And so what do you see like business owners messing up when it comes to like really wanting to bring in an A player, but the best I can get is a B player?
Yeah, it's so interesting and it changes in the different job markets, right? But what we're seeing right now is a couple of things. Companies, especially when the market gets tight and they have a lot of candidates on the market, companies want to be really selective, but that really increases their time to hire. They spend a lot of time in the interview process. They send A players through rounds and rounds and rounds of interviews. They take a long time to make the decision. And number one, you don't have someone in seat doing the work for months and months. And I see this a lot for the senior level leaders. When you're bringing on a C-level leader, companies get really, really selective, which is important, but selective doesn't have to mean slow. Mm-hmm. And so you're without an A player in that seat for a really long time. And when you're taking a candidate through months and months and months of this rigmarole, you're losing A players to other opportunities that are snapping them up faster, or you're losing their trust in the process because they're interviewing you too. And I think that's where a lot of companies forget is that it's not just the compensation package. It's not just, the role, but it's also how they're going to be treated in that role. And in an A player, I see a lot of companies miss that step.
Well, I think there's a delicate balance, right? We see a lot of small business owners that they hire far too quick. They have one interview and they're like, I like you, you're hired, right?
Yeah, we vibe.
We vibe, right? And then you get on the other side, which is, the person who drags their feet, like you said, for months and months and months. So there's sort of like this middle ground.
There certainly is. There's a middle ground in finding that right talent. And it's really about having the hiring process be smooth for the candidate and be thorough. And I'm not saying bring someone in that you like and run with it, because as we know, as small businesses, it's really hard to make a hire at that level. And it's incredibly expensive to rehire, right? We all know that. But as small businesses, my own business, we're a team of 15. We have very low attrition, thank goodness. And that reason is, though, I've got a long bench cycle. So because we work with public company board directors, the CEOs of the biggest companies in the world, things like that, we really need to bring our A game, and I have to have A players. But to be honest with you, I don't always have an A player budget, right? For just, unending talent. So what does that look like? And it's around having a really strong employer brand in the market. And it's around having a bench of people I have my eye on that, I know from the industry that I think could come in and do great work. And it's around compensation. We pay that one of the highest compensations in our industry. And we do that because we need A players to be here and want to be here and stay here because it matters for our brand.
Yeah. Well, compensation is interesting, right? Because you're going to have a small business owner that will say, let's use 100,000 for easy math. That's $100,000 cost for me, which actually they're not looking at it the right way. See, well, one of the things that we share with our clients is that you want to hire for the KPI, right? You don't want to hire for just work to get done. You hire for the KPI. So if you understand the KPI and the impact that that's going to make to both top and bottom line revenue, then you're making an investment. So you're going to say, I'm going to invest $100,000. And in my investment, my expectation would be the KPI will achieve this marker. And by achieving this KPI, my ROI will be, X or Y, whatever that might be.
Exactly. And we're in the middle of creating a new role right now. And that's exactly the conversation we're having is what do we want the outcome to be? And then back into, okay, what can we pay for this in a reasonable way? Because this is what we need to deliver on. And where can we get that in the market, right? In a way that makes sense.
Right. In compensation, it can be really interesting, right? Because compensation doesn't always have to be 100% salary either.
It doesn't. And that's one of the things we work with our candidates on is compensation negotiation. We work with our candidates everywhere from thinking about what they want to do next, their resume, LinkedIn profile, all that stuff that they need to show up in the market. But then it's also how are you going about your search? How are you showing up in interviews? And then compensation negotiation to make sure you're maximizing that final offer. And it's interesting because we talk about the negotiables and the non-negotiables with a candidate before they ever get an offer so that we have an idea of what they're looking for. And very often there's a lot of things that are non-negotiable or are really strong like to haves that aren't compensation related. And it's more about flexibility or a hybrid work environment or fully remote or vacation time. We have a candidate right now that, they, for some family reasons, need to take a lot of time off, and they're willing to take a really big hit in compensation to make that vacation time work for them. And as a small business, the one way I like to work with my candidates on things, is if it fits into their career goals from a title perspective, because the title can influence their future earnings for the rest of their career. And especially for women, title has more of an influence on your future earnings than anything else. And so if you're a small business and you can't pay for a C-level, a seasoned C-level professional, you can bring an A player in that has high potential and give them a higher title or a title to work towards. And that can make up for some of that compensation as well.
Sure. And on the compensation, if the business owner or the CEO or the team, depending on the size of the company, right? But for the most part, our listeners, they're going to be 6, 7, 8-figure CEOs. So, when we're hiring, it's going to be the CEO that's going to be very involved. And so for many of the candidates, if they see a really compelling, intriguing, exciting vision, then for a lot of times what I found is that they're willing to take a lower base salary for an extremely compelling vision with a marker of performance tied to their compensation. So if you hit Y, then we'll give you, this much, and then you hit Z and we'll give you this much and so forth. And if they believe in the vision and they believe in the CEO and they believe in, the impact that they're making in the organization, you oftentimes can get a lower base salary. I've seen this several times where candidates will actually choose a company where they're getting paid less because they believe so much in the CEO and their vision that they want to go along for that ride.
This is so incredibly true. The overwhelming majority of candidates I talk to say, I want to XYZ in salary. Here's the kind of role I'm looking for. But I would take less for the right job, the right culture, the right leader, and a company I can believe in, or a company that does something good in the world, whatever it is. It doesn't have to necessarily be nonprofit, but it's about, I've had a client recently say, but that I can honestly say isn't doing harm in the world. And I think that vision, that direction, that being out there as the CEO, which is uncomfortable for some CEOs, right? Not everyone wants to be out front and center, but it is a really strong part of your employer brand. And you're absolutely right. The overwhelming majority of our candidates say they want a team and a leader they can believe in, and they'll take a compensation hit for that.
That's one of the bigger differences that I've noticed between A players and B players and C players is when I'm interviewing an A player, if they ask me the question about what is your vision? Where do you see the future of the business going? I know that this is somebody that, is looking beyond just the salary. But when interviewing somebody and they're just so focused in on how much am I going to get paid and what's the bonus structure going to look like and so forth, that tells me right off the bat, if they ask me no question about the vision of the company, where we want to go, I know that they're not an A player. I've never met an A player that never asked me about vision.
100%. And that's a really great point. The interview process, and it's funny, even at these most senior levels, our candidates haven't had to interview for a job in a really long time. They've been on the other side of the table, but they haven't had to do it. And I've never had to do it at this level for themselves. And the people that do the best in these interviews are the ones that show up with curiosity. It's not about saying all the things you know. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being curious about the future of the business, what the business needs, what the challenges are, pushing on some of those things. And those are the people that do best in interviews because they're showing they're already, committed to the future of the business. They're already thinking about how do they fit into what the business needs, not how do they come in and change all the things, right? And so it's a really great reminder that we need to show up to interviews with curiosity about where the business is headed.
Now, you've brought up the word employer brand. I know you and I have talked about that quite a bit, about having a real strong employer brand, right? And big companies like Amazon and Facebook, there's a reason why they don't have any issues bringing in A players. There's a long line of candidates who want to go work for Facebook or, any of those. When you're talking about a small business, a company that might be just doing, a few million to a few tens of millions, an employer brand, it's kind of like back burner. They're so focused on filling the sales pipeline. And so they just don't think about what does that mean to have an employer brand. But you work from the candidate's perspective. You build the candidate's brand so they have a solid resume and they look like an A player. Well, why is it so important for the business owner to have an employer-facing brand?
Yeah, it's so important for a couple of reasons. Number one, just so that you have a healthy pipeline of potential candidates and they know you exist, right? Especially, and I know it's hard for startups sometimes to get that visibility. You're not going to be an Amazon in the market. You're not a household name. But if you're showing up to the industry events where your potential candidates could be, right? We show up to a lot of industry events that, to be honest with you, we've outgrown from a content perspective, from conferences, things like that, because we're leading in the market in a lot of these areas. But I show up because my potential candidates could be there. I'm meeting people. I'm seeing how they interact. I'm being more visible. I'm speaking at these events. I'm showing up and not being an a-hole, to people and like, oh, wow, she might be someone I'd want to work with. So I think there's ways that you can grow an employer brand that isn't thinking about, what is your LinkedIn strategy, things like that, things that we think about with a bigger brand. It's really more about just being active and involved in the market from the way that you want to show up to a potential candidate.
Sure. I look at it this way. When somebody, you and I know Joe really well, right? My COO, and he's a killer dude and he's an A player, right?
Absolutely.
Joe proudly tells people he works for predictable profits, right? And that's the thing, like, he wants people to know, he wants his friends to know, he can feel proud of it. He's like, this is where I work. And it's funny because you want that when people end up working for somebody, you want them to come out in the marketplace and be like, I am so proud that I work for such and such. It's kind of like, my son, he works at a restaurant, right? And so the first question that I ask him is, do you eat their own food? Do you eat their food? And he goes, I love it. I actually love their food. And it's one of my favorite restaurants. And that makes me feel comfortable eating at the restaurant, right? But he was like, yeah, there's better, right? But it's the same thing. It's like when somebody says, I'm going to put your name on my resume, this is going to say a lot about me. And I want to make sure by having your name on my resume, I can be proud when I go to dinner with my friends and I go to my college reunion and they're saying, hey, where do you work? I can tell them and I can be proud of where I tell them whatnot. So as an employer, what are you doing in your culture, in your brand, and everything else makes your employees proud to be part of your organization?
Hey, if you're listening to the Beyond Seven Figures podcast, you may already have a great business and you've cracked that elusive seven-figure mark. But let's be honest, building a business is one thing, but scaling it to true, lasting profitability is a whole other ballgame. That's why I'm excited to share something special with you. It's the Predictable Profits Playbook written by Charles Gourdette. So go now to beyond7figures.com.
Yeah, it's so incredibly important. It's one of those things, even in our own business. And again, we're a small business, but we do this because we see the companies that do it well, really excel in being able to bring in A players. And one of the things is, we have a 3-pillar mission statement, but one of those pillars is that we want to raise the bar for excellence in our industry in service delivery and in reputation for this industry. And one of those ways is we just show up with excellent quality every single time. And so the people that work for us can know it honestly helps them in their own work. And it's a resume builder because they know if they work for us, that it's a big boost on their resume and they're proud to be here. And I can't say that, of every company and things like that, but it's around the service delivery, the quality, and it matters to people. And I know candidates matter. I've had candidates take jobs and then come back, 3 months later and say, I'm really killing it. I'm an A player. I'm delivering on all my KPIs and bringing more business than they've ever seen before. But the service delivery side can't keep up with what I'm delivering on, and it's hurting my reputation. And so we need to remember, if we bring an A player in, especially in a sales capacity or marketing capacity, can we, their reputation is tied to the deliverable on the back end. And it really, really matters. So we need to know, if we bring someone in, can we actually deliver on that? Because if not, they're going to leave.
Yeah, you're so right. And at the same time, A players want to be around other A players.
Yes, so absolutely they do.
Yeah, if they turn around, they come in the team and they look around and they feel like, nobody else is an A player, that also is going to add to them wanting to look somewhere else. So,
yep.
Something to consider. And when we talk about employer brand, before we move on, we know that the majority of these candidates are going to go to LinkedIn. They're going to look at the company on LinkedIn. And does the company have a professional banner, LinkedIn corporate page that's active, that's well designed, that has, all their fun stuff listed and so forth? That's really important.
It is. It's really a minimum barrier to entry, and it's easy and it's cheap. It doesn't cost anything. So have the employer page, have it up, have it active, have some things on there. Our team, we have everyone on our team post occasionally just to make sure that even if they're not necessarily front facing, they need to be posting to just, or engaging with the company page just to kind of keep visibility up, right? It matters to see, if we're a company that helps people with LinkedIn profiles, are our team engaging in our own stuff? Because if not, then that's probably an issue.
Now let's see here. Title for small business owners, the title and the role doesn't match often.
Right. So true.
So, they'll turn around, and one of the common things I hear all the time is, I'm going to hire a CMO. And they turn around and they hire a CMO, but then they expect the CMO to do stuff that, somebody at a much lower level would be expected to do.
Yeah, a marketing manager could have done, or less.
Exactly. And so the title and the role is something that's really important. First, a lot of small business owners, they're like, they think in terms of titles, and they create this job description that is just, let's take CMO. And they put a job description. Basically, I want you to cover every element of marketing on the planet, and I'm going to hire you for this. And, but it's like, and then they bring somebody on and they realize that they're not getting the results that they want, and they blame the person instead of realizing, no, actually, you brought in a CMO. You did. But a CMO is at the level where they've been promoted to a point where they're strategists, and they have executors that are below them that they're managing to get the stuff done. A CMO in general is the strategist in the marketing role. They're generally not expected to roll up their sleeves and write email copy and all that other kind of stuff.
And they haven't had to do it in a long time. They lead leaders that do that. They don't. So glad you brought this up, because this is something I see all the time. We have candidates come to us. Candidates typically come to us if they're looking for the next best thing and want to be ready, or if they're starting a serious search for whatever reason. And one of the catalysts for that is, especially if they work at a startup or a smaller business, is I was hired to be a CMO. It happens a lot, or a COO, or a, chief strategy officer. And the business wasn't ready for me. They didn't need what I do. They weren't ready for the level that I bring. And now I'm just sitting on a shelf, and it's a career killer for me because I'm not going to have anything to show for my time here. So it's time to leave pretty quick. And so what happens is, and I see it happen all the time, companies think they want one thing, but they actually want another. And it's such a good point you bring up. If you bring in a CMO, you're not getting tactical marketing work, or if you are, it's probably subpar and you're overpaying for it because it's not what they do. And so really thinking about what you want and what you need delivered, and then what you need to pay for that and what skill set you need to bring in for that. I know we had this conversation the other day about sales teams. One salesperson is not the same as every other salesperson, because you've got, your hunters and your farmers and your closers and all of those things. What do you need from that person? And I think we need to really think about what we actually want in that role and what those KPIs are, like you had mentioned, and then back into what are the skills I need to hire for that, and not just the title we think of. Oh, I need a CMO. I need someone to run marketing. Well, you may not need that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's not only understanding the right title, but in the job description, like, be really crystal clear on, hey, here's the KPI. This is what needs to get happening in order to get the KPI. Don't hire for somebody and then all of a sudden expect they are going to do everything. And I think, as a CEO and a business owner, we're used to wearing multiple hats. And so we're like, oh, I'm going to hire somebody and they're going to wear all the different hats too. And I'm expecting them to be awesome. And until they realize, wait a minute, I need to hire somebody. I need to create a lane for them and keep them in that particular lane. And that's where they're really going to excel.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we need to think about it as we do our businesses, right? We need to niche down and really stay in our lane where we really excel. And it's the same with our team members. We can't expect a team to do all the things. So we need to be thinking about what are those pieces we really need, and then telling the candidate, here are the pieces I need. Here are the things that I need you to do in the first 30, 60, 90 days, laying those things out ahead of time so they can be set up for success. Because an A player wants to come in and deliver results immediately too. And so we've seen the opposite happen of, if you're not ready for them to come in and really drive results, then you're both going to be frustrated.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. Why do people leave? Why do A players leave? We talked about hiring them, but why do they leave?
Yeah, so they leave for a couple of reasons. It's rarely ever compensation. It is more often a leadership change, and they're not on the same page with their leader. I see that happen a ton. I was hired by XYZ, things were going great. Then a new CEO came in and we're just not on the same page. We're not vibing. We're not on the same page, and I don't see growth here. And then that's the other thing is growth potential. We have candidates who, I'll be honest, we have a client right now who makes $7 million a year with a Fortune 10 company.
Wow.
And he's looking, and he said, I don't really care about the money, but my career growth opportunities are over here. There's nowhere else to go. And so we need to be thinking with our A players, even if we don't have new titles and new divisions, we're small companies, but what else can they tackle? What else can they take on to continue to grow? Because they're not going to want to stay stagnant forever. And so that's one of the things we need to be thinking about as leaders, is how do we keep them fresh and how do we keep them engaged? Because otherwise they get bored, right? And then it's around the stability of a company. We see a lot of A players leave when they start to see signs of instability, or, there's a lot of strategy change. There's some cash flow issues. When they start seeing writing on the wall about that, it makes them nervous, especially if they're not in the conversations. If they're in the conversations, they'll stay till they're the last ones to turn the lights off. But if they're not in the conversation, they're going to bounce pretty early.
Oh, that's so true. And to your point, if you're sitting here listening, I want you to ask yourself, how well do you know your A players? Or you're just your team members? Know what their goals are, both their professional and their professional goals, like personal and professional. What are their goals? What's most important to them? Where do they want to go in their career? And how are you helping them to support that? I find that the best culture that I can create for myself is more like work-life integration, right? Mm-hmm. Not work-life balance, but work-life integration, meaning that it's like, what's really important to you and your family and things going on, and how it can work in life sort of, kind of meld together. So if you have a goal of wanting to buy a new home, like, how can I help you actually reach that goal of getting a new home? So you have a goal of, moving to the beach. Okay, well, what would that actually need to look like? How would we need to evolve over the course of time to get you over that beach, and so forth? So there's a lot of different things that are important to them, but oftentimes they're like, I'm working to do this, but they don't convey that over to their boss, or their boss has never really asked before.
Right.
And so if the employer actually asked, like, what do you hear? What do you want to achieve? What would make working for this company the best decision for you in your career what needs to be true. When you find all that stuff out, it becomes an important part of employee retention. You also get more out of the employee. They seem to be a little bit more emotionally invested.
Absolutely. And it's one of the lessons I forget a lot, even though I see it in the market all the time. We recently had a promotion opportunity on our team, and we started kind of feeling around, seeing who might be interested in things like that. And the person we thought would be first in line for it was not interested because it didn't fit their lifestyle goal of what they were looking for. And we didn't know that because we'd never asked. We just assumed. And this happened just a few weeks ago. We thought, okay, lesson learned. Again, we need to be asking what people want and what's motivating them to be here.
No, it's so true. So true. Well, we've covered a lot between, we've talked about the differences between A players and B players. We talked about having a strong employer brand. We talked about compensation. We talked about having the right title. We talked about why people leave. What's another question that I should be asking you that I haven't thought of asking?
Oh, it's such a great question. I would think about, from the business standpoint of thinking about what future state looks like. I think a lot of times we hire for now it's already on fire and we're behind and we can't keep up. And we need to be thinking about what are those hires, those strategic hires need to look like to get us to that next level. Because sometimes we can't get to that next level without making that hire and making that stretch. And sometimes it's hard to do that without a guaranteed ROI on these things, right? It's hard as a business leader when you're trying to keep cash flow up, things like that. But thinking about what future state looks like, what is that one role if you could have on your company that would really drive you to the next level? And I think that's sometimes where we need to be thinking versus just constantly filling to put out fires. And that's one of the things that I know has grown our business individually is thinking about, okay, what is that? What do we need next to really get to that point? And maybe you're not able to hire for that right this second, but you can be thinking about it for, we have a role on tap for 2026 of, okay, we really need this, but we can't do it right this second. But what does that look like? And now we can start thinking about who are those candidates that make sense for that? Because you don't want to just put a job ad out on LinkedIn, friends. You're going to get a bazillion responses and to sift through, and it's going to be really awkward and hard and labor intensive, right? But be thinking about what that future state looks like is really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. What are the constraints that you're solving for? What are the opportunities that you're trying to I also don't find it very successful when somebody hires somebody for an existing problem and they're like, so here, figure it out, as opposed to, figuring it out yourself and then have somebody then optimize it to make it that much better. But that usually is, I see another mistake there where it's like, oh, we have a problem here. I'm going to hire somebody to figure it out. It's like, very rarely does that actually work.
This is so true. And this one of the mistakes I made early on is I had hired someone, hired an A player. She was fantastic, but I hired her to figure it out and she put some systems together, things like that. But then she owned those systems and then the business was tied to her. And that was really painful when we ended up having to break up, right? And I had to figure out where all the switches were and who pays for what and where things are. So as a founder, we really need to stay, hands-on on those things. Sometimes, we can delegate too much. And then we lose control of some of the areas of our business. And so I think that that's one of those things, as we started to unwind and look at things, I thought, oh, wow, there's a lot of things going on that probably wouldn't have done it that way. Or, oh, I didn't realize we were doing that. And things like that, where if I had figured it out in the beginning and then I hired someone to deliver on it, number one, it would have been cheaper. And number two, I would have had more control as a business owner in how it gets delivered and who's tied to the business. So I think that's a really important point. And, the last thing I'll say real quick is a plug for Predictable Profits. I've been a client almost a year now, and having other business leaders to bounce ideas off of when you're in the trenches with team stuff is so incredibly important. We can't always talk to our teams about what's going on or where we want to hire or cash flow issues or what's next, things like that. And having other people we can bounce ideas off of is absolutely invaluable.
It's Rod, one of our other members, he said this perfectly, where he's like, our mouth is just 1 inch from our nose, but it takes somebody else to tell us we have bad breath.
That is so true.
Yes. But, how many times have you ever been in a situation, I know it happens to me almost daily, where the most obvious answer is sitting right in front of me the whole time, but it takes somebody else to be like, have you looked at doing it this way? And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
absolutely,
that's what I needed.
Yep, 100%. I have to say that probably happens to me at least monthly in our group calls of, yeah, it's right there. That did not occur to me. Never thought about it. I'm too close to it, right?
Well, half the time we'll be sitting there and it's like, it's funny. I just gave this advice to somebody else, but I didn't think about taking it myself. Like, so, that's the thing when you work with such smart people, it's like most of the time they already have the answers. It just takes somebody else to just be like, idiots. You just told me this information, but have you ever looked at doing it yourself? And it's like, oh, wow, look at that. Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, that's a shocker. I had a candidate say that the other day. She said, because we were talking about whether she should leave or not. She's been a long time client and she's in a company that CEO changed over and now, things aren't vibing and we're talking about it. And she said, as we talk about this, if I were talking to one of my mentees, I would say, you have to leave. This is not healthy. But for me, I'm too close to it. I'm tied to it. And I felt like I needed to stay. And I'm you've got to talk it out loud sometimes to see, okay, this, either is or isn't working, or here's things you need to think about.
For sure. Absolutely. Now, my favorite question to ask our guests, this is the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. What would you say is your biggest, best tip for anybody who wants to take their business beyond seven figures?
Put yourself in a room with people who think bigger. I think a lot of times, and for me, as an early, starting my business, I was thinking really small. I'm a Midwestern, I grew up in the Midwest, grew up blue collar, things like that. The dreams for me were small, and everyone around me, that was just our frame of mind, right? And so I had to physically move and change the circles I spent time in to realize that there was a bigger option and that it could be a 7-8 figure business, or that was possible for me. And I think we need to surround ourselves with people that think bigger, that can push us out of our comfort zone, because if we just stay in our own head and our limiting beliefs, we're never going to get there.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And it's funny because I see you, like when you said that, I was like, that's interesting. But I have always seen you as a huge thinker, right? So, but maybe you are a huge thinker because you put yourself in a position to
I
be.
appreciate that. And I've done a lot of coaching. I've spent a lot of time and money trying to get bigger, think bigger, get out of my own comfort zone, right? Because my frame of reference was small. And so sometimes we have to get out of our fish tank and go somewhere else, right?
Yeah. Well, it's true. It's true. That's really smart. I love that. Deborah, we talked a lot about what it's going to take in order to attract and keep A players within an organization. And, one of the things that, we don't emphasize enough, but we talked about earlier too, is the importance of somebody having a really compelling vision. Like that CEO, that business owner having a really compelling vision. And, is that vision going to be big enough to attract those A players to want to work with you and be a part of that vision? Is that vision compelling enough that they're willing to work with you, even if right now maybe you can't afford the biggest salary, but you can offer them some level of performance incentive or bonus moving forward? It's a really big thing that I want to emphasize that, our listeners take away from. But, if anybody wants to learn more about you and the work that you do, where do we send them?
Yeah, follow me on LinkedIn. We do weekly LinkedIn lives, and my team and I post a ton of content around the executive job search, finding board seats, and just showing up as a senior leader in the workplace. So Debra Boggs, Debra Boggs, and you can learn more about our work on our website at dscareermanagement.com.
Awesome. So that's Debra Boggs on LinkedIn, and then dscareermanagement.com.
Yes, sir.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
All right. So that wraps up today's episode of Beyond Seven Figures podcast. Again, A players is a big difference. If you want a 10-to-1 ROI thereabouts, look at A player as an investment. When you go to B players, you might get more of that 2-to-1. C players, well, it could be a little bit more of an expense break even. Don't be hiring people to just do work and get stuff done. Hire people for a particular KPI. Know what the impact of that KPI is going to look like, and reverse engineer it so okay, if I am going to spend this amount of money, if I'm going to invest this amount of money, what is a reasonable ROI that I expect to achieve? You run those numbers, you see how it looks, and you could see that A players might be a little bit more affordable than you think. So again, this wraps up today's episode of Beyond Seven Figures podcast. My name is Charles Goodett with my friend Debra Boggs, and I will see you in another episode.